Bible stories. Moses, David, Daniel, Jesus, Noah. Welcome to my channel.
Before there were great kings remembered for glory, before songs were written about victories and empires carved their names into history, Israel stood at a turning point, a moment suspended between what it had been and what it was about to become. For generations, the people had lived without a human king, guided instead by judges, leaders raised in times of crisis, men and women who delivered them from enemies but never established a permanent throne. Their identity was different from the nations around them. They were meant to be ruled directly by God, their lives shaped not by royal command but by divine instruction. Yet over time, something began to change within the heart of the people. The surrounding nations had kings, visible leaders who rode into battle, who commanded armies, who represented strength and stability in a way that could be seen and touched. Israel began to look outward instead of upward, and the desire for something tangible began to grow. It did not happen all at once. It rarely does. The shift began quietly, as a thought, as a comparison, as a question that lingered beneath the surface of daily life. Why should we be different? Why should we not have what they have? Why should we continue in a way that feels uncertain when others seem secure? These questions did not remain unspoken. They gathered strength, moving from private thoughts into public demands, until the people approached the prophet Samuel with a request that would change their future forever. They wanted a king. To Samuel, the request was more than political. It was personal. He had served as their leader, their judge, their guide, and now it seemed as though they were rejecting everything he had done. But the response he received from God revealed something deeper. The people were not rejecting Samuel, they were rejecting God as their king. It was a shift in allegiance, a decision to place their trust in human authority rather than divine rule. And yet, despite the warning, despite the consequences that were clearly explained, the people did not change their minds. They insisted, they demanded, and in the end, they received exactly what they asked for. God gave them a king. His name was Saul. At first glance, Saul appeared to be everything they wanted. He stood taller than anyone else, a man whose physical presence alone commanded attention. From the shoulders up, he was above the rest of the people, a figure who looked like a king even before he acted like one. In a culture that valued outward strength and visible leadership, Saul fit the image perfectly. If the people were looking for someone who resembled the kings of other nations, they had found him. But appearances can be deceiving. Saul's story does not begin with arrogance or pride. In fact, when he is first introduced, there is something almost surprising about him. He is not seeking the throne. He is not positioning himself for power. When Samuel reveals that he has been chosen by God, Saul's reaction is not confidence, but hesitation. He speaks of his background, of his tribe, of his family, as though trying to explain why he does not belong in such a position. There is a humility in him, or at least something that resembles it, a sense that he does not fully understand why he has been chosen. Yet even in this moment there are hints of something deeper, something that will become clearer over time. When the time comes for Saul to be publicly presented as king, he cannot be found. The people gather, waiting for the one who has been chosen, but Saul is not standing among them. Instead, he is hiding among the baggage, concealed, removed from the moment that is meant to define the beginning of his reign. It is an unusual detail, easy to overlook, but significant. The man who would become king begins his story not by stepping forward, but by holding back. Eventually he is brought out, and when the people see him, their reaction is immediate. They shout in approval. They see what they wanted to see. A king who looks the part, a leader who matches their expectations. The doubts, the hesitation, the hidden beginning, all of it is overshadowed by the image before them. And so Saul is established as the first king of Israel. At the beginning of his reign, there are moments that suggest promise. When the Ammonites threaten the people, Saul rises to the occasion. He gathers an army, leads them into battle, and secures a victory that unites the nation. In that moment, he does not act out of pride or self-interest. Instead, he shows restraint, even mercy, refusing to punish those who had previously doubted him. It is a glimpse of what his leadership could have been, a moment where his actions align with what was expected of a king chosen by God. But moments do not define a life, consistency does. And over time, the pressure of leadership begins to reveal what is truly within Saul's heart. Being king is not simply about winning battles or commanding attention. It requires obedience, patience, and trust in God, even when circumstances become uncertain. It requires the ability to wait, to follow instruction, to resist the urge to take control when control has not been given. This is where Saul begins to struggle. The first major turning point comes during a time of tension, when the people are preparing for battle against the Philistines. The situation is unstable, the army is nervous, time is passing, and the prophet Samuel, who is meant to offer the sacrifice before the battle, has not yet arrived. Saul watches as his men begin to scatter, fear taking hold as they anticipate what is coming. The pressure builds, the responsibility feels overwhelming, and in that moment, Saul makes a decision. Instead of waiting for Samuel, he takes it upon himself to offer the sacrifice. On the surface, it may seem like a small action, even a practical one. The situation is urgent, the people are afraid, the battle is approaching. But the issue is not the act itself, it is the disobedience behind it. Saul steps into a role that was not his to take. He acts not out of trust, but out of fear, choosing immediate control over patient obedience. And almost as soon as the act is completed, Samuel arrives. The timing is exact, almost painfully so. Saul explains his reasoning, justifying his decision, pointing to the circumstances, the pressure, the fear of losing his army. But Samuel's response is direct and unyielding. Saul has acted foolishly. He has not kept the command that was given to him, and because of this his kingdom will not endure. It is a moment that marks the beginning of something irreversible. The man who had been chosen, who had been given the throne, who had been given the opportunity to lead Israel under God's authority, has taken his first step away from that authority. It is not a dramatic rebellion. It is not an open rejection. It is something more subtle, more dangerous. It is the decision to trust himself instead of God. And from that moment forward, the direction of Saul's life begins to change. The king who once showed promise will begin to unravel. The throne that once seemed secure will begin to slip, and the favor that once rested upon him will not remain forever. The echo of Samuel's words did not fade when the prophet turned and left. They remained with Saul, lingering in the silence that followed, pressing into his thoughts with a weight that could not be ignored. The kingdom would not endure. The statement was clear, direct, and final. Yet life did not immediately collapse around him. The throne still stood. The army still answered to his command. The people still called him king. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But inwardly, something had already begun to fracture, something that would slowly widen until it could no longer be hidden. Saul continued to lead, to fight, to govern, but there was now a subtle shift in the way he carried himself, a tension that had not been there before. The confidence that once came from being chosen had been replaced with something less stable, something that depended more on circumstances than on conviction. The relationship that had once defined his authority, the connection between him and God, was no longer as clear as it had been. It had not disappeared entirely, but it had been disrupted, and that disruption would soon reveal itself in a way that could not be denied. Another command was given, this time more specific, more demanding, and more revealing of what was expected of Saul as king. Through Samuel, God instructed him to go against the Amalekites, a people whose history with Israel was marked by hostility and opposition. The command was not simply to defeat them in battle, but to carry out complete judgment, to leave nothing behind, to hold nothing back. It was a difficult command, one that would test not only Saul's leadership but his obedience. It required him to act not according to his own reasoning, not according to what seemed beneficial or practical, but according to what had been spoken. Saul gathered his army. He prepared for battle. And when the moment came, he acted with strength and decisiveness. The Amalekites were defeated. The victory was clear. The threat they posed was removed. From a military perspective, Saul had succeeded. But the story does not measure success by outcome alone. It measures it by obedience. And in that, Saul failed. Instead of carrying out the command completely, he made a choice. He spared Agag, the king of the Amalekites. He allowed him to live. And beyond that, he kept the best of the livestock, the sheep and the cattle that were considered valuable, refusing to destroy what appeared useful. The rest, the things that were weak or of little worth, were destroyed as instructed. It was a partial obedience, one that followed the command in form but not in spirit. At first glance, the decision might seem reasonable. Why waste what could be used? Why destroy what could benefit the people? These are the kinds of thoughts that often accompany compromise, the kind that feels justified, even wise, but quietly moves away from what was required. Samuel, however, was not unaware of what had happened. Before Saul even returned, the word of the Lord came to Samuel revealing the truth, and the response was not indifference, it was grief. Samuel mourned for Saul, recognizing that the king who had once been chosen had now taken another step away from obedience. The next morning Samuel went to meet him. Saul, unaware of the full weight of the situation, approached the meeting with confidence. When he saw Samuel, he spoke first, declaring that he had carried out the command of the Lord. The words came easily, almost as though he believed them, almost as though the victory itself had convinced him that what he had done was enough. But then came the question, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? The sound of the animals, the very evidence of Saul's disobedience, could not be hidden. It exposed the truth in a way that words could not cover. Saul's response was immediate, but it revealed something deeper about his condition. He shifted the responsibility. He pointed to the people, saying that they had spared the best of the sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord. The explanation sounded spiritual, even noble, but it did not change the reality of what had been done. Samuel's reply cut through the justification. To obey is better than sacrifice. The statement carried a weight that reached beyond the moment. It revealed a principle that defined the relationship between God and those who follow him. It is not outward action that matters most, not even acts that appear religious or meaningful. It is obedience. It is alignment with what has been commanded, not what has been reinterpreted or adjusted. Saul stood there, confronted not only with his actions but with the truth behind them. His disobedience was not an accident. It was a choice, a decision to follow his own judgment instead of the instruction he had been given. And that choice had consequences. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. The words fell with finality. This was not a warning. It was a declaration. The separation that had begun with his first act of disobedience was now complete. The favor that had once rested upon him had been removed. The throne he still sat on was no longer supported by the same authority that had placed him there. For the first time, Saul's response changed. The confidence was gone. The justification weakened. He admitted that he had sinned, that he had transgressed the command of the Lord. But even in this admission, there was something incomplete. He spoke of fearing the people, of listening to their voice, revealing that his decisions were no longer driven by obedience, but by the desire to maintain control, to preserve his position, to respond to pressure rather than to truth. And then, in a moment that revealed the state of his heart, he made a request. He asked Samuel to honor him before the elders of Israel. Even as he acknowledged his failure, his concern remained focused on how he would be seen, on the image he would maintain before others. It was a subtle but powerful indication that his priorities had shifted. The relationship that had once defined his leadership had been replaced by something else, something rooted in appearance rather than substance. Samuel turned to leave, but Saul reached out and took hold of his robe, and as he did, the fabric tore. It was a small physical moment, yet it carried a symbolic meaning that could not be ignored. Samuel stopped and spoke again, using the torn robe as a representation of what had just been declared. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. The future had already been decided. The throne would not remain with Saul. Another would rise. Another would take the place that had once been his. And though Saul would continue to sit on the throne for a time, though he would continue to rule, to command, to act as king, the reality behind that position had changed. The foundation had been removed. The direction of his life had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. The man who had once hidden among the baggage, uncertain and hesitant, had become a king who acted out of fear, who disobeyed out of pressure, who justified his actions, and who sought honor even in the face of failure. The unraveling had begun, and it would not stop here, because losing God's favor was not the end of Saul's story. It was only the beginning of his descent. The silence that followed Samuel's departure was heavier than any battlefield Saul had ever stood upon. It was not the silence of peace, nor the quiet that comes after victory. It was the kind of silence that lingers when something irreversible has taken place, when words have been spoken that cannot be taken back, and when the future has already begun to move in a direction that no human effort can change. Saul remained king in appearance, seated on the throne, surrounded by soldiers, advisors, and the structures of power that defined his rule. Yet something essential had been removed. The authority he still held was no longer rooted in the same foundation. It was as though he stood on ground that looked solid but had already begun to give way beneath him. Not long after, another shift occurred, one that would define the next phase of Saul's life in a way that could not be hidden. The Spirit of the Lord, which had once come upon him with power, departed from him. In its place came something far more troubling, something that brought with it unrest, agitation, and a darkness that seemed to move through his thoughts without restraint. The text describes it as a tormenting spirit, one that disturbed him, unsettled him, and left him in a state that was both unpredictable and deeply unsettling. The king who had once been chosen, who had once been empowered, was now a man in conflict with himself. Those around him began to notice the change. His servants observed his distress, the way his mood shifted without warning, the way his presence carried a tension that could not be explained by circumstance alone. In an attempt to bring relief, they suggested something simple, something practical. They proposed finding someone who could play music, someone whose skill with an instrument might calm the unrest within the king. It was not a solution to the deeper issue, but it was a way to ease the symptoms, to bring moments of peace into a life that was becoming increasingly unstable. And so they searched. Among those they found was a young man named David, the son of Jesse, a shepherd from Bethlehem. At this point, David was not known as a warrior or a king. He had not yet faced giants or led armies. He was simply a young man with skill, with courage, and with something else that could not be easily defined. The description given of him is telling. He was skillful in playing, a man of valor, prudent in speech, and the Lord was with him. That final detail, though brief, carries weight. It stands in quiet contrast to Saul, whose relationship with God had already begun to fracture. David was brought into Saul's service. When he played, something changed. The music filled the space, and for a time, the torment that had settled over Saul would lift. The agitation would fade. The darkness would retreat, if only temporarily. In those moments there was a sense of relief, a return to something resembling peace. Saul found comfort in David's presence. He appreciated the effect he had, the way his skill could quiet what nothing else seemed able to control. And so David remained, moving between his role as a shepherd and his place in the king's court, unaware of the full extent of what lay ahead. But the calm would not last, because while Saul struggled internally, the external pressures of leadership continued to grow. The Philistines, long-standing enemies of Israel, gathered again for battle. Their presence was not new, but this time, the confrontation took on a different form. Instead of immediate conflict, a champion stepped forward, a giant of a man named Goliath, whose size and strength made him a figure of intimidation. Day after day, he stood before the armies of Israel, issuing a challenge, calling for a single warrior to face him in combat. The response from Israel was not courage, it was fear. The soldiers, trained for battle, accustomed to conflict, hesitated. The king, who stood at their head, did not step forward. The situation lingered, unresolved, each day adding to the tension, each challenge reinforcing the fear that had taken hold. And into this moment, David entered. He was not there as a soldier. He had come to bring provisions to his brothers, to check on their well-being, to carry out a simple task. But when he heard the challenge, when he saw the fear that had settled over the army, something within him responded differently. Where others saw an opponent too great to face, David saw something else. He saw a defiance not just of Israel, but of God. His perspective was not shaped by size or strength, but by faith, by a belief that the situation was not defined by human ability alone. When he spoke, his words reached Saul. At first, The idea seemed improbable. A young shepherd offering to face a warrior who had intimidated an entire army did not fit the expectations of what victory should look like. Saul questioned him, not out of malice, but out of realism. David was young. Goliath was experienced. The outcome seemed clear before the battle even began. But David did not argue from theory, he spoke from experience. He described the times he had faced danger while protecting his flock, the moments when he had confronted lions and bears, when he had acted not out of strength alone, but out of trust, and he made a statement that shifted the focus of the conversation. "The Lord who delivered me will deliver me." It was a declaration of faith, simple yet profound, rooted not in his own ability, but in his understanding of who God was. It stood in stark contrast to Saul, whose decisions had increasingly been shaped by fear, by pressure, by the need to control outcomes rather than trust in something beyond himself. Saul listened, and eventually he agreed. He offered David his armor, a gesture that reflected his own understanding of what was needed for battle: protection, weight, the visible elements of warfare. But when David tried to wear it, it did not fit. It was not meant for him, and so he set it aside, choosing instead what he knew, what he had used before, what aligned with who he was: a staff, a sling, 5 smooth stones. The scene that followed would become one of the most well-known in all of Scripture. But in this moment it was simply a confrontation between two individuals standing on opposite ends of expectation. Goliath approached with confidence, his armor heavy, his presence overwhelming. He looked at David and saw someone unworthy of the challenge, someone easy to defeat, someone who did not belong on the battlefield. But David did not see it the same way. "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin," he said, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord." The difference was clear. One relied on visible strength, the other on something unseen. The outcome was swift. A single stone, released from the sling, struck with precision. The giant fell. The battle that had seemed impossible was resolved in a moment that no one had expected. The reaction was immediate. The army of Israel surged forward, the fear that had held them back replaced by action. The Philistines fled. The victory was complete. And in the midst of it all stood David, no longer just a shepherd, no longer just a musician in the king's court, but a figure whose actions had changed the course of the moment. For Saul, the victory brought something unexpected. It was not relief alone, it was something else. As the people celebrated, as the songs began to spread, a new comparison emerged. One that would begin to shape the next phase of Saul's life in a way that mirrored something seen before in another story. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The words were simple, but their impact was not. Because in that moment, something began to rise within Saul. Something familiar, something dangerous. The same kind of feeling that had once led another man down a path of destruction, jealousy, and just like before, it would not remain contained. The song did not fade. It moved through the streets, from village to village, from gathering to gathering, carried by voices that did not fully understand the weight of what they were repeating. It was sung in celebration, in triumph, in the joy of victory that had come when fear had once held an entire army in place. But for Saul, those words did not sound like celebration. They sounded like comparison. They sounded like something being taken from him, something slipping through his grasp while he still sat on the throne. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The numbers themselves were not the issue. It was what they implied. It was the shift in attention, the redirection of honor, the subtle elevation of one man over another. Saul heard it, and something within him responded immediately, instinctively, and with a force that he could not easily control. He became very angry. The text does not soften the reaction. It does not present it as mild irritation or passing discomfort. It describes a deep displeasure, a disturbance that settled into his thoughts and refused to leave. From that moment forward, Saul began to look at David differently, no longer simply as a servant, no longer as the young man who had brought relief through music or victory through courage, but as something else, a threat. It did not matter that David had acted in faith. It did not matter that the victory had benefited Israel. It did not matter that Saul himself had permitted him to face Goliath. What mattered now was perception, the way the people saw David, the way they spoke about him, the way his name was being lifted. And jealousy began to take root. It did not appear all at once in full force. It rarely does. It began as a thought, as a question, as a subtle shift in perspective. What more can he have but the kingdom? The idea formed quietly but powerfully, linking David's rising reputation with the future that Samuel had already declared. The kingdom would be given to another, to one better than Saul. Now, in the presence of David, that declaration began to feel less distant, less abstract. It began to feel real. The next day, the tension within Saul intensified. The tormenting spirit returned, stirring unrest within him, amplifying the emotions that had already begun to grow. David was there, as he had been before, playing music to soothe the king. It was a familiar scene, one that had previously brought relief. But this time, something was different. Saul held a spear in his hand. The weapon was not unusual. Kings carried weapons. Soldiers stood ready. The presence of a spear did not, in itself, signal danger. But what followed revealed the change that had taken place within Saul as David played. Focused on his task, unaware of the shift that had occurred in the king's heart, Saul made a sudden movement. He hurled the spear. The intention was clear. I will pin David to the wall. The thought was no longer hidden. It had moved from feeling to action, from internal struggle to external expression. The jealousy that had taken root now revealed itself as violence, echoing a pattern seen long before in another story, where emotion had led to action with irreversible consequences. But this time, the outcome was different. David moved. The spear missed. It struck the wall behind him, embedding itself in the surface where, moments before, David had stood. The room, once filled with music, was now marked by the evidence of what had nearly occurred. It did not happen only once. Saul attempted it again. And again, David escaped. The situation could no longer be dismissed as a moment of instability. It revealed intent, a shift that could not be undone. Saul, the king of Israel, had attempted to kill the very man who had served him faithfully, who had fought for his kingdom, who had brought him relief in times of distress. And from that moment, fear entered the equation. Saul became afraid of David. It is a striking detail. The king who held authority, who commanded armies, who sat on the throne, feared the young man who had once stood before him with a harp. But the fear was not rooted in physical strength alone. It came from something deeper. The Lord was with David, and had departed from Saul. The contrast was undeniable. It was not merely about ability or reputation. It was about presence, about favor, about something that could not be manufactured or controlled. Saul recognized it, even if he did not fully understand it, and that recognition intensified both his fear and his hostility. Unable to act openly without consequence, Saul changed his approach. He removed David from his immediate presence, appointing him as a commander over 1,000 men. On the surface, it appeared to be a promotion, a recognition of David's ability and success, but beneath it, there was another intention. By placing David in positions of danger, in constant exposure to battle, Saul hoped that the threat he perceived would be removed without direct involvement. It was a calculated decision, but it did not produce the desired result. David continued to succeed. In every mission, in every battle, in every responsibility given to him, he acted with wisdom and effectiveness. The people saw it. They responded to it. Their support grew, their admiration deepened, and with it, Saul's fear increased. Because the more David succeeded, the more it confirmed what Saul had begun to believe, that the future did not belong to him. It belonged to David. And so Saul devised another plan, one that appeared less direct but carried the same intention. He offered his daughter in marriage to David, presenting it as an honor, a reward for his service. But the condition attached to the offer revealed the strategy behind it. David was to prove himself by fighting against the Philistines, by bringing evidence of victory that would place him in even greater danger. Again, the expectation was clear, that David would fall. But once again, the outcome was not what Saul intended. David succeeded. Not only did he fulfill the requirement, but he exceeded it, returning with more than was asked. The victory was undeniable. The result was unavoidable. David became Saul's son-in-law, and the connection between them grew more complicated, more personal, more inescapable. Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. It was another layer, another element that bound David more closely to the king's household, making the situation more complex than a simple rivalry. This was no longer just about a servant and a king. It was about family, about relationships intertwined in ways that could not be easily separated. Yet none of this reduced Saul's hostility. If anything, it intensified it. Because every new success, every new connection, every new affirmation of David's position made the reality clearer. The kingdom was moving in a direction that Saul could not control, and he knew it. The fear that had begun as a response to a song had now become a defining force in his life. It shaped his decisions, influenced his actions, and altered his relationships. It turned admiration into suspicion, trust into hostility, and leadership into obsession. Saul was no longer simply ruling, he was reacting, and the man he once welcomed into his presence had become the center of everything he feared losing. The unraveling continued, and it was far from over. The distance between Saul and David was no longer measured in physical space alone. It had become something deeper, something rooted in perception, fear, and the quiet certainty that the future was slipping from one man's grasp and moving steadily toward another. What had begun as admiration had turned into suspicion, and suspicion had hardened into intent. Saul was no longer reacting in isolated moments. His actions were becoming deliberate, shaped by a growing determination to remove what he could not control. At first, the tension remained contained within the walls of the palace. It revealed itself in sudden movements, in watchful glances, in decisions that placed David in increasingly dangerous positions. But as time passed, Saul's thoughts began to move beyond private conflict into public strategy. The threat he perceived could no longer be managed through distance or indirect action alone. It needed to be eliminated. And so Saul spoke to those closest to him. He told his son Jonathan and his servants to kill David. The instruction was clear, but the response was not what Saul expected. Jonathan did not see David as a threat. He saw him as a friend. Their bond had been formed not through politics or obligation, but through something deeper, something that connected them in a way that defied the tension surrounding them. Jonathan recognized David's character, his faith, his loyalty, and the hand of God upon his life. Where Saul saw danger, Jonathan saw purpose. And so, instead of obeying, Jonathan warned David. He spoke to him privately, revealing his father's intentions, urging him to be cautious, to remain hidden while he attempted to reason with Saul. It was a moment that placed Jonathan in a difficult position, caught between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his friend, but his actions revealed where his convictions lay. Jonathan then approached Saul. He spoke not with accusation, but with reason. He reminded his father of what David had done, of how he had risked his life to defeat Goliath, of how his actions had brought victory to Israel. He asked a question that cut through the situation with clarity. Why should you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? For a moment, it seemed as though the words reached Saul. He listened, and in that moment of clarity, he swore an oath. As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. It was a temporary restoration, a pause in the unfolding conflict. David was brought back into Saul's presence. For a time, the tension eased. The relationship appeared to return to something resembling what it had once been, but the change was not permanent, because the issue had never been fully resolved. It had only been delayed. War broke out again, and David went out to fight as he had before. Once again, he succeeded. Once again, victory followed his actions. And once again, the pattern repeated itself. The torment returned to Saul. The agitation, the unrest, the instability that had marked his inner life rose again, stronger, more consuming than before. And with it came the thoughts that had not been removed, only suppressed. The presence of David, once a source of relief, now became unbearable. And once again, Saul took up a spear. David was playing, fulfilling the same role he had before, unaware of how quickly the situation had shifted. The moment repeated itself. But this time it carried even more weight, because it revealed that the oath Saul had made had not changed his heart. The spear was thrown, and again David escaped. This time there was no return to normal. There was no restoration. The line had been crossed too many times. Saul sent messengers to David's house. watching it, waiting for the opportunity to strike. The intent was no longer hidden. It had moved beyond the palace, beyond private moments, into a direct attempt on David's life. But once again, the plan did not unfold as expected. Michal, Saul's daughter and David's wife, intervened. She saw what was happening. She understood the danger, and she acted quickly, helping David escape through a window under the cover of night. It was a decisive moment, one that revealed where her loyalty lay. The daughter of the king chose to protect the man her father sought to kill. David fled. The palace, once a place of service, of music, of rising honor, became a place of danger, a place he could no longer return to. The life he had known changed in a single night. He was no longer a commander in the army, no longer a welcomed presence in the king's court. He became something else, a fugitive. He went to Samuel, seeking refuge, seeking understanding, seeking direction in a situation that had escalated beyond anything he could have anticipated. Together they went to Naioth, a place associated with the prophets, a place that represented connection with God in a way that contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding in Saul's court. But even there, Saul's pursuit did not stop. He sent messengers to capture David, yet something unexpected happened. As the messengers approached, they encountered the presence of the prophetic community, and instead of carrying out their mission, they began to prophesy. The same thing happened again when more messengers were sent. The pattern repeated itself, as though something beyond human control was intervening, disrupting Saul's plans in a way that could not be explained by strategy or effort. Finally, Saul went himself. Determined to complete what his servants could not, he approached the place where David and Samuel were, but even he could not resist what he encountered. The Spirit of God came upon him, and he too began to prophesy. Stripped of his royal composure, overcome by something that temporarily halted his pursuit, it was a moment of irony, almost paradoxical. The king who had been rejected, who had lost favor, who was acting in opposition to God's will, found himself overtaken by the very presence he had moved away from. Yet even this moment did not change the direction of his life. It did not restore what had been lost. It only delayed what was coming, because once the moment passed, the pursuit would continue. David could no longer remain. The pattern was clear. Saul would not stop. The jealousy that had begun with a song had now become a relentless force, driving actions that affected not only Saul and David, but everyone connected to them. Relationships were strained. Loyalties were tested. Decisions carried consequences that extended far beyond individual lives. And at the center of it all stood a truth that could not be ignored. Saul was no longer acting as a king under God. He was acting as a man trying to hold on to something that had already been taken from him. And the more he tried to hold on, the more everything began to fall apart. Night had become David's ally, where once he had walked openly through the courts of the king, moving with confidence among soldiers and servants. Now he moved in shadows, guided not by position but by necessity. The transformation was complete. David, who had once played music to calm the king, who had once led troops into battle under Saul's command, was now a man running for his life. And behind him, relentless and unyielding, stood Saul, no longer acting out of momentary anger, but out of something far more consuming: possession. David did not immediately understand the full extent of it. Even after escaping the spear, even after fleeing the palace under the cover of darkness, there remained a question within him that refused to settle. Why? What had he done to deserve this? What offense had turned loyalty into pursuit, service into threat? These were not the questions of a rebel or an enemy. They were the questions of someone who had remained faithful, who had acted in good conscience, who had not sought the throne yet found himself treated as though he had already taken it. In search of answers, David returned to the only person who might speak truth into the confusion. Jonathan. Their meeting was not one of casual conversation. It was urgent, tense, filled with the weight of uncertainty. David spoke openly, his words carrying both frustration and disbelief. What have I done? What is my guilt? What is my sin before your father that he seeks my life? The questions were direct, unfiltered, revealing not only his confusion but his desire to understand something that no longer followed reason. Jonathan struggled to accept it. He knew his father. He knew his tendencies, his moments of anger, his shifting moods. But to believe that Saul had fully committed to killing David was something he could not immediately embrace. He reassured David, insisting that his father would not act without revealing it, that such a decision would not remain hidden. But David knew differently. He had seen the spear, he had felt the intent, and he understood that something had changed within Saul, something that no longer followed patterns that could be predicted or reasoned with. And so they devised a plan, a test, simple in structure but revealing in outcome. A new moon feast was approaching, a gathering where David's absence would be noticed. Jonathan would observe Saul's reaction, watch for signs, listen for words that would reveal the truth of his intentions. If Saul responded with calm, with understanding, then perhaps there was still room for restoration. But if his reaction was marked by anger, by hostility, by violence, then the answer would be clear. The plan was set. David hid in the field. Jonathan returned to the table. The first day passed without incident. Saul noticed David's absence, but said nothing, assuming that there was a reason, something temporary, something that did not require immediate response. It was the second day that revealed everything. When David's place remained empty, Saul turned to Jonathan. His question was simple: why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal? Jonathan responded as planned, explaining that David had requested permission to visit his family, to be present for a sacrifice taking place in his hometown. The explanation was reasonable, respectful, and offered without confrontation. But Saul's reaction was immediate, and it was not calm. Anger erupted, not controlled or measured, but intense and revealing. His words turned harsh, directed not only at David but at Jonathan himself. He spoke with accusation, with contempt, exposing the depth of what had taken hold within him. He made it clear that as long as David lived, Jonathan's own position, his own future, his own claim to the throne would never be secure. It was no longer hidden. It was no longer uncertain. Saul's intent was fully revealed. And in that moment, something shifted within Jonathan as well. He saw the truth, not as something distant or exaggerated, but as a reality that could no longer be denied. His father's actions were no longer driven by reason or justice. They were driven by fear, by jealousy, by a need to eliminate what he could not control. Jonathan rose from the table. He did not eat. He left in anger, not against David, but against the injustice he had just witnessed, against the reality that his father had chosen a path that would lead only to destruction. The next morning he went to the field. The signal was given. The arrows were shot beyond the mark, a clear message that David could not return, that the danger was real, that the pursuit would continue. When the moment allowed, they met. There are a few moments in the story as heavy as this one: two men standing in a field, not as enemies, but as friends bound by loyalty in the midst of circumstances they did not choose. Jonathan spoke first, offering words that carried both sorrow and clarity. "Do not be afraid. My father will not lay his hand on you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you." It was an acknowledgement of what had already been declared, of what had already begun to unfold. Jonathan did not resist it. He did not fight against it. He accepted it, even though it meant the loss of his own position, his own future as king. Their bond was sealed again, not by circumstance, but by choice. And then they parted. David left. Jonathan returned, and the distance between them became more than physical. From that moment forward, David's life would be defined by movement, by escape, by survival in a world where the king himself sought his death. He would move from place to place, from refuge to refuge, learning not only how to survive, but how to trust in a way that went beyond safety or certainty. And Saul, he did not stop. The clarity of that moment did not lead to reflection or change. It only solidified his resolve. The pursuit would continue, not as a passing conflict, but as a defining mission, one that would consume his time, his energy, and ultimately, his legacy. The line had been drawn. There was no return. The king and the one who would replace him now stood on opposite sides of a path that would only move further apart, and the further Saul pursued, the further he would fall. The wilderness did not welcome David with comfort. It did not offer security, nor did it provide the kind of stability that a man once accustomed to the king's court might expect. Instead, It stripped life down to its most basic elements. Survival replaced routine. Vigilance replaced rest. Every sound carried meaning. Every shadow held the possibility of danger. This was no longer the life of a commander or a musician. It was the life of a fugitive, a man forced to navigate a world where trust was rare and safety was never guaranteed. Yet even in this harsh environment, something unexpected began to take shape. David was not alone for long. Men began to gather around him, not the powerful or the influential, but those who were distressed, indebted, and discontented. They came not because of status, but because of something they saw in him, something that drew them despite the uncertainty of his situation. These were not the kind of men one would choose to build an army, yet they became exactly that. Under David's leadership, this group began to change. Discipline replaced disorder. Purpose replaced frustration. What started as a collection of outcasts became a force that would one day shape the future of Israel. Meanwhile, far from the wilderness, Saul sat on the throne, but his focus was no longer on governing a nation. His attention had narrowed, consumed by a single objective: finding David, eliminating David. The responsibilities of kingship faded into the background as the pursuit became central. Reports came in. Sightings were shared. Each piece of information fueled the obsession, drawing Saul deeper into a mission that would not bring him peace, but only drive him further from it. The contrast between the two men grew sharper with each passing day. David, though hunted, continued to act with restraint. Saul, though secure in position, acted with increasing instability. The man with nothing began to gain strength. The man with everything began to lose control. At one point, David sought refuge in the city of Nob, where the priests served. He came not as a conqueror, but as a man in need. Hunger and urgency shaped his request. The priest, unaware of the full situation, provided him with bread, even the consecrated bread that was not meant for ordinary use. It was an act of compassion, of provision in a moment of need. David also received a sword, a detail heavy with meaning. It was the sword of Goliath, the very weapon taken from the giant he had defeated. Now, in exile, that same sword would serve him again, not as a symbol of victory, but as a tool for survival. But the moment did not remain hidden. A man named Doeg, an Edomite in Saul's service, saw what happened, and he remembered when Saul later spoke of David, when he expressed frustration that no one had informed him, that no one had revealed where David had gone. Doeg stepped forward. He spoke of Nob, of the priest who had helped David, of the provisions given, of the sword taken. The information changed everything. Saul's response was immediate. He summoned the priests. When they stood before him, they did not come as enemies. They came as servants, unaware that their actions had placed them in danger. Saul questioned them, his words shaped by suspicion and anger. The priest responded with honesty, explaining that David had always been faithful, that he was the king's servant, the son-in-law, a man trusted and honored. There was no awareness of rebellion, no intention of defiance, but truth did not matter in that moment. Saul had already decided, "You shall surely die." The command was given, not just for the priest, but for all who stood with him. It was a decision that crossed a line far beyond the pursuit of David. It was no longer about eliminating a perceived threat. It was about destroying anyone associated with him, regardless of innocence or intent. Saul's own guards hesitated. They would not carry out the order. Even in a kingdom where obedience to the king was expected, there remained a boundary that they would not cross. Killing the priests of the Lord was not something they could justify, not something they could bring themselves to do. But Doeg did not hesitate. He stepped forward, and what followed was an act of violence that revealed how far Saul had fallen. The priests were killed, not in battle, not in defense, but as an act of judgment driven by fear and suspicion. And it did not stop there. The city of Nob itself was destroyed. Men, women, children, even animals, all were struck down. It was a moment that echoed something seen earlier in Saul's life, when he had been commanded to carry out judgment and had held back. Now, without command, without instruction, he unleashed destruction in a way that went beyond what had ever been required of him. The irony was undeniable. He had once failed to fully obey when commanded. Now he acted with complete destruction when he was not. The news reached David, and when he heard, the weight of it settled heavily upon him. He recognized the connection, understood that his presence, his actions, had led to this outcome. It was not something he had intended, but it was something he could not ignore. "I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house." The words were spoken to Abiathar, the son of the priest who had escaped. It was a moment of responsibility, not in the sense of guilt for the act itself, but in the acknowledgement of the chain of events that had led to it. David did not dismiss it. He did not distance himself from it. He recognized it, accepted it, and responded with protection. "Stay with me. Do not be afraid." In that moment, the contrast between him and Saul became even clearer. One destroyed, the other protected. One acted out of fear, the other acted out of responsibility. And as the story continued, the separation between them grew wider. Saul was no longer simply pursuing David, he was unraveling. The king who had once been chosen to lead Israel under God had now become a man capable of destroying his own people in the name of control. The authority he held was no longer guided by purpose, but by obsession. The decisions he made no longer reflected leadership, but desperation. And David, though still hunted, though still moving through uncertainty, was becoming something else, not just a survivor, but a leader shaped by the very trials meant to destroy him. The wilderness was not just a place of hiding, it was a place of transformation. And while Saul descended further into darkness, David was being prepared for something far greater. The wilderness had become more than a place of hiding for David. It had become a proving ground, a place where decisions carried weight not only for survival but for identity. Every moment presented a choice, not just between action and inaction, but between becoming what he was being hunted as, or remaining who he truly was. And as Saul continued his relentless pursuit, those choices became sharper, more defining, more revealing of the path David would ultimately take. News came to David that the Philistines were attacking Keilah, a city of Israel, plundering the threshing floors and threatening its people. It would have been easy, even reasonable, for David to ignore it. He was a fugitive. The king sought his life. His own survival was uncertain. Why risk everything for a city that might not even protect him in return? But David did not act on impulse. He sought the Lord. It was a pattern that had begun to define him, one that stood in contrast to Saul's increasingly reactive decisions. Where Saul acted out of fear and urgency, David paused, asked, waited for direction. And the answer he received was clear: go, fight, save Keilah. Even then the men with him hesitated. They were already in danger. The idea of confronting the Philistines added another layer of risk, another possibility of loss. But David sought confirmation again, and once more. The direction remained unchanged. So they went. The battle was swift and decisive. The Philistines were driven back. The city was saved. It was another moment of victory, another demonstration of David's leadership, even in exile. But victory did not bring safety, because word reached Saul. David was in Keilah, a location, a place that could be surrounded, a moment of opportunity. Saul's response revealed the state of his thinking. God has delivered him into my hand. The interpretation was striking. Saul viewed the situation not through the lens of truth, but through the lens of his own desire. What aligned with his goal, he attributed to God, even though his actions stood in opposition to everything he had once been called to uphold. It was a distortion, a redefinition of reality to fit his purpose. He gathered his men, prepared to attack, not the Philistines, but his own. David learned of it, and once again, he did not act blindly. He sought understanding. He asked a question that revealed both wisdom and awareness. Would the people of Keilah, the very ones he had just saved, protect him? Would they stand with him against Saul? The answer was not what one might hope. They would not. They would hand him over. It was a sobering realization, one that revealed the complexity of human loyalty under pressure. Gratitude did not guarantee protection. Good deeds did not ensure faithfulness. In the face of the king's authority, the people would choose survival over allegiance. And so David left. The wilderness called him back. He and his men moved again, from place to place, avoiding capture, staying one step ahead of Saul's pursuit. The pattern continued, a constant movement shaped by necessity, by the need to remain unseen, unpredictable, out of reach. At one point, Saul came dangerously close. so close that the distance between them could be measured in moments rather than miles. In the wilderness of En-Gedi, Saul entered a cave, unaware that deep within it, hidden in the darkness, David and his men were waiting. The situation was almost unreal in its precision. The man who had spent so long pursuing now stood within reach, vulnerable, exposed, unaware. David's men saw it immediately. This is the day. The opportunity was undeniable. The king was alone, no army, no protection. One action could end everything. The pursuit, the danger, the uncertainty. All of it could be finished in a single moment. They urged him, take it, end it. But David did not move as they expected. He approached quietly, not with a weapon raised, but with restraint. Instead of striking Saul, he cut off a corner of his robe. A small act, almost insignificant in appearance, yet filled with meaning. It was proof of proximity, evidence of opportunity, a demonstration of what could have been done, and even that troubled him. His heart struck him, because even in that small act, he recognized the line he was approaching, the boundary he was unwilling to cross. Saul, despite everything, was still the Lord's anointed. The position he held, though corrupted, was not something David would take by force. He stopped his men, refused to let them act, and waited. When Saul left the cave, unaware of how close he had come to death, David followed at a distance. Then he called out, his voice breaking the silence, drawing Saul's attention back. "My lord the king," Saul turned. And what followed was not an attack. It was an appeal. David bowed, not in submission to Saul's actions, but in recognition of his position. And then he spoke, revealing the truth, exposing the reality of what had just occurred. He held up the piece of the robe, the evidence of his restraint. "I could have killed you." The words were not spoken in pride, but in clarity. But I did not. It was a moment that forced Saul to confront something he had avoided. The man he pursued, the one he believed sought his throne, had just chosen not to take his life when given the chance. Saul's response was unexpected. He wept, his voice broke as he spoke, acknowledging the truth before him. "You are more righteous than I." The admission was real, at least in that moment. He recognized David's restraint, his integrity, his unwillingness to act out of revenge. And for a brief time the pursuit paused, not ended, but paused, because the pattern within Saul had not been broken, only interrupted. The realization of his own actions, the acknowledgement of David's righteousness, did not lead to lasting change. It was a moment of clarity in a life increasingly defined by instability, and David knew it. He did not return. He did not assume safety. He continued to move, to remain cautious, to live in the tension between promise and reality, because he understood something that Saul did not, that a moment of emotion does not equal transformation. And as long as Saul remained who he had become, the danger would remain. The wilderness still held its purpose, and the story was still moving toward its final turning point. The end does not always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it comes quietly, almost unnoticed at first, hidden beneath the continuation of patterns that have been unfolding for a long time. For Saul, the final chapter of his story did not begin with a single dramatic moment, but with a deepening silence, a growing absence that revealed itself not in what was happening around him but in what was no longer happening within him. God no longer answered. There was a time when Saul could seek direction and receive it, when the voice of God came through the prophet, through dreams, through the means that had once guided his decisions. But now, when he inquired, there was nothing. No response, no guidance, no confirmation. The silence was complete, and it was more terrifying than any enemy he had ever faced, because it left him alone. The Philistines gathered once more, preparing for battle, their presence pressing against the borders of Israel with a force that demanded response. Saul saw their army vast and organized, and fear rose within him, not the kind that sharpens focus, but the kind that unsettles the mind, that weakens resolve. The king who had once stood tall now faced a reality where he had no direction, no assurance, no sense of what was to come, and in that desperation, he made a decision that revealed just how far he had fallen. He sought out a medium. It was an act forbidden, something he himself had once removed from the land in an effort to align Israel with what was right. Yet now, in the absence of God's voice, he turned to something he had once rejected, seeking guidance not from the source he had abandoned, but from one he knew he should not approach. He went in disguise. The king, hidden beneath ordinary clothing, moving at night, avoiding recognition, seeking out a woman known for her ability to call up spirits. The scene is almost surreal. A man who once held authority now acting in secrecy, driven by fear, by the need to know what would happen next. The woman hesitated at first. She knew the risk. The laws against such practices were clear, the punishment severe. But Saul reassured her, swearing that no harm would come to her, and so she agreed. When she attempted to call up the spirit, something happened that startled even her. She saw Samuel, and she realized who stood before her. Saul, the king himself. The conversation that followed carried a weight unlike anything else in the story. Samuel spoke, not with comfort, not with guidance, but with finality. "Why have you disturbed me?" Saul explained his situation, his fear, the silence he had encountered, the need for direction. But Samuel's response did not change the outcome. "The Lord has turned away from you." The words confirmed what Saul already knew but had not fully accepted. The separation was complete. The relationship that had once defined his leadership was gone. And more than that, the future had already been decided. "The Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your neighbor, David." The name was spoken directly, no longer implied, no longer distant, and then came the final statement. "Tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me." Death was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. Saul fell to the ground. The strength left him, not because of physical exhaustion, but because the weight of what he had heard was too much to carry. The man who had spent so long trying to control the outcome, to hold on to his position, to resist what had been declared, now faced a moment where none of it could be changed. The next day, the battle began. The Philistines advanced, Israel responded, but the outcome was not in their favor. The army began to fall. The pressure intensified, and in the midst of it, Saul's sons were struck down. Among them was Jonathan, the one who had stood by David, the one who had acted with integrity, the one who had recognized what his father could not accept. His death marked not only the loss of a son, but the collapse of what remained of Saul's legacy. The battle closed and Saul was wounded. The archers had found their mark, and the king who had once stood above the people now found himself on the edge of defeat, surrounded, injured, aware that capture was near. And with that awareness came another fear, one that drove his final decision. He did not want to be taken alive. He did not want to fall into the hands of his enemies, to be mocked, humiliated, displayed as a defeated king. And so he turned to his armor-bearer, asking him to end his life. The armor-bearer refused. He could not do it. And so Saul acted himself. He fell on his own sword. The king of Israel died not in victory, not in restoration, but in a moment defined by fear, by isolation, by the culmination of choices that had led him further and further away from what he had once been. His armor-bearer followed. The battlefield fell silent. And with it, the reign of Saul came to an end. The man who had begun with promise, who had been chosen, who had been given the opportunity to lead under God's authority, had lost everything, not in a single moment, but through a series of decisions, each one moving him further from obedience, further from trust, further from the foundation that had once supported him. And in contrast, somewhere beyond the battlefield, David still lived, the one who had been pursued, the one who had been tested, the one who had chosen restraint when given opportunity, the one who had waited instead of taking. The story does not end with Saul alone, it continues, but his life stands as a warning, not of failure alone, but of drift, of how a man can begin in the right place and slowly move away, not through a single act, but through a pattern of choices that reshape the heart. Because Saul did not lose everything in one day. He lost it one decision at a time. If this story made you think, then ask yourself this: what really destroyed Saul? Was it fear, pride, or disobedience? Comment your answer below. If you watched until the end, type "Obedience is better than sacrifice." Like and subscribe for more dark, powerful Bible stories, because the next story may be even more dangerous.